update, then let's go ahead and move into our third item, discussing our continuing discussion of 911 data. So I'm going to bring some new folks into the meeting, if you bear with me for a second. Okay, I think we have the folks we want to have in the meeting at this point. Carrie, would you like me to bring up your presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay. Get my screen going here. Okay. Everybody can see it just fine? Carrie, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Flanagan and Council members, Mayor. My name is Carrie O'Connor, Chief Innovation Officer for the city. For today's presentation on the calls for service data, the quick agenda, we're going to do a recap and underscore the purpose of this analysis, building off of last presentation. We'll offer some key insights and show you some of the dashboards, as well as some key opportunities that are revealed. And at that point, we'll open it up for conversation. And there's other dashboards we can review of interest. The tail end of this presentation is a long appendix of references and definitions and some of those extra dashboards. So we can make reference to those as necessary throughout the presentation. Next slide. So the goals as we've been going through this presentation, and you can move to the next slide, are really to get as clear a picture of our local reality as possible. As we have dug into the data, we realized that there's some process issues that we need to understand about how this data happens in Austin at our level. And as much as possible, we're working to create a transparent and jointly held understanding of how the calls for service data works. And then we've set up dashboards to assist the Austin community answer their lines of inquiry as we co-creatively reimagine public safety. With this jointly held understanding in these dashboards, we're trying to do a bit of a self-service model on some of these data analysis, and then framing further lines of inquiry where we can bring that data back again forward to this committee, the task force, and to the community. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over now to Jonathan Kringen, the Chief Data Officer for APD. He was the one who instructed me on sort of the variability and reliability issues with the calls for service data, so I'm going to leave it to him here to do a quick recap on things we need to understand about the data.
Thanks, everyone. So working with Carrie has provided a forum for me to think a little bit about one of the key goals as I transition to this position, which is about making these data transparent. And we want to share this with you to give a sense of the complexity of the data, because we have to have a very strong mutual understanding of what the data are, how they come to be, and so we can really begin to understand how they can answer certain questions, but not other questions. We also hope that a greater understanding of the way the Austin Police Department data exists can hopefully further the discussion of the kind of key issues right now, while at the same time helping us figure out better ways to collect data to move forward and be able to answer the kinds of questions that we currently can't. So when we think about the CAD data, a couple of important things to remember are that the CAD data is primarily about calls for service. It's about what the public is calling into the department or in to inquire about, to ask for assistance and whatnot. And the data themselves fundamentally change throughout the process, right? So when a call initially comes in to 911, the individual is going to share as much information as they can. The call taker is going to discuss with them the event. And as you can see in the very beginning of the slide, they're going to assign this initial incident type. Now, sometimes that may be the extent of the information you have in the system about that incident. Other times, the incident itself moves forward, the process moves forward, and you can have a dispatch. And so dispatch indicates the need for service, and we're going to respond. So at that time, this kind of incident type is going to relate to this initial problem code. And a lot of times, looking at the APD data, that initial problem code may be the extent of what's available. And so, yet, it's important to understand that there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether that's actually what's being responded to or not. So as officers arrive on the scene in response to what's happening, they're going to be collecting information about what's happening on scene, and as a result, they might update that problem code. And that's going to give you a little bit better sense of what's happening. As well, the kind of dispatch that it should have been would be updated in the system. And of course, we're going to kind of mark the time that they got there. But you can see we're already indicating in this process that what we understand the event to be is actually changing throughout time. This can continue to go through in the system where after the incident is over and the entire data collection has happened, if you will, and the officer may make an interpretation as to what actually occurred there, that disposition code could be updated again. So the reliability issue that comes into play when we discuss this is that because this changes over time, we have to understand at which point that disposition was coded in the system to give us a sense of what the value of that information is. So this relates to the kind of questions we'd like to be able to answer when we think about things. We've been engaged in discussions about the types of calls for service that can be transferred to other organizations or maybe handled through other processes. And this understanding helps us illustrate the need for additional analysis to understand that this information as it comes in may not paint a complete picture. So we can begin to think about the kind of error rates that are involved in this process of making decisions at that point in time. So this gives a general sense of what happens in the process and how that relates to the data that are actually in the system. So the kind of key points to understand from this, starting with the first one, is that a call for service itself relates to a huge amount of situational ambiguity. The average citizen calling in to ask for assistance is generally not educated about the definitions of various types of codes that we would use as a police department. They're going to tell us what's happening, and that's going to be interpreted. So there's a huge amount of error there. That rolls into a second problem where this data system is built to try to manage an activity. It's not actually built to support research or analysis. It's not actually built to run a sort of process on to move in the direction of efficiency. And so there are many things within the data that the way they're set up, they're functional and they serve the operational need, but they don't actually serve the analytic function that should come thereafter to help figure out what best practices should be. We see very often when people are looking for calls for service data, there's kind of a hyper focus on the calls that have a large volume, right? What is it primarily that we're responding to as a department? But as you go through the different codes and begin to look at them in great detail, there are a huge number of sort of small volume problem categories, but they're really important. They can be important in the sense that they relate to certain public safety problems. They can be very important in terms of the amount of time that it takes officers to respond to those calls to service. And they can also be important in that they may reflect certain kinds of underlying issues that we might want to consider in the context of other possibilities for response. There are a number of categorizations. It's a relatively large number of categories that we look at. So we have to think about these, even though these particular categories are quite small, there could be clustering across categories that might help us understand ways that we might respond. Also very important to understand is that these data reflect what the citizens are telling, what they're bringing to the police department and their understanding of issues happening throughout the city. It's not really a proxy for crime. You'll notice in the notes that we have a number of different issues that don't exactly line up, right? And so this can relate to that issue of whether or not information's been updated in the system, but also, reflecting the fact that as the information comes in, it's not remarkably reliable as to what the event actually is. So to move beyond that, what we have to do is we have to move into working backwards from the data that we house in our records management system. Now, that system, unlike the CAD, which tells us a lot about what the public is asking for, what the public is bringing to the police department, the RMS system reflects primarily what the department is doing in response to those things. And so those two systems are a little bit different, meaning that the data in each system actually answer a very different set of questions. So as we try to work toward transparency and sharing more data, it's very important that we generate an understanding that some kind of questions really have to come from one set of data, whereas other kind of questions have to come from another set. As we look at the RMS data, we begin to get into things about understanding the types of events where an officer wrote a report, where there may have been a citation issued, where there may have been an arrest issued, and clearly those are very important for understanding some aspects. It is also important to understand that linking these two data sets reflects certain challenges as we move forward with things like considering a new RMS system for the department. Those are some of the issues that we're looking at. And so the final issue that comes in here that causes a great deal of confusion is that as the FBI has transitioned from the Uniform Crime Report reporting standard to the NIBRS reporting standard, the way things count would be entirely different. And quite simply on that, any single incident could be a variety of different criminal crimes, right? Whereas under the old system, we're simply counting the top crime, and that's all that it is. In the NIBRS system, we're trying to be more specific by counting everything that's happening in any event. Our different systems, our different reports for reporting standards use one or the other classification, and this can cause a great deal of confusion as we might issue a report that might not reflect what's in a different data set that we put on the open data portal, or that might be a little bit different than maybe what we're doing, analyzing these data to share information with you. So all of those caveats are very important to understand, and addressing those will help us move in the direction of being able to report in a more detailed way. So I'll turn it back over to Carrie to put this in context of the reimagining effort.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. If we can move to the next slide. So we just noted here the key lessons in a summary. We can move to the next slide. So in referencing this data for reimagining, we want to be cognizant of the situational ambiguity. And this is thinking about what callers and call takers and officers think something is versus how the situation is framed through law enforcement vocabulary, how incidents escalate or de-escalate before or after arriving on scene, and how investigation on scene may change the nature of the problem category. We want to be cognizant of the data variability and reliability, thinking about how this data is created and how the system's categories have been changed over 16 years. For example, I'm told there are about 86 initial call problem types, but of course in our data we have hundreds, and that's because some of these categories are lying fallow in the system, or sometimes they have to add an X or a Z in order to administratively handle what appears on their screen. And finally, we want to inform a future-oriented exploration of what could be, rather than seeking a strict statistical validity. So by that I mean, when I look at this data, I'm thinking in terms of patterns, flows, journeys, orders of magnitude, possible intervention points, potential hypotheses, and or measuring the success of pilots rather than looking at specific percentage points. Because of the data variability and reliability, there may be things that are sort of relationally true or relatively true, for which we don't have a specific point with very low error rate, if that makes sense. And so let's get to how we can then apply this for the next slide. In thinking sort of, there's a journey of the incident where there's an initiation of a call, there's the dispatch of that call, the call is on scene, the incident gets closed out initially, but then perhaps for some calls there's further inquiry or investigation, and then you have the very long tail of the various criminal justice system processes. When we think about reimagining, the kinds of ideas that have been before us have been, how do we prevent certain incidents? How do we reform or transform how we handle certain incidents? How do we divert things out of a particular system? Or how do we maybe just decouple things completely from how the system is currently run? And when we think about the supporting data that can inform this reimagining, I've kind of tried to align here. We may look at how calls are initiated, or their volume, or their types, or their trends, to maybe think about how to decouple or divert. An example of prevention on the EMS side is the community health paramedics trying to prevent non-emergency use of ambulances. So we know we can use various processes and teams and strategies in different ways. Host is an example of diversion, and most recently mental health calls is an example of diversion. So this is to sort of say, how will we use this data in the reimagining process? This is but a suggestion. Next slide. So let's move to key insights. This is a visualization that looks at that call transformation process, where we start with ambiguity, and then over time, some of the incidents are updated, and then they go through a disposition process, and you can sort of see then how it transitions from the computer-aided dispatch to the crime report. So this is a representation of 2019 calls for service and the 2019 crime report data. In 2019, we had 517,000 calls. You can see 65% of those are dispatched, whereas 35% of those are officer-initiated. Out of all of those types of calls, 35% of them get updated with a call problem update. And of those 517,000 calls, 24% get a written report. Out of those 517,000 calls, 21% of them can be traced over to crime report data. We haven't traced that ourselves, but proportionally, this is where the representation is. And then 4% of those 517,000 calls are cleared by arrest. Other possible endpoints include a citation, warning, crash report, field observation. So this sort of gives you a sense of magnitude and flow of the data through the system. Next slide. So orienting to this data, our top insights are that 41% of police officer time is spent on priority 3 calls. I'll go through the priorities in just a minute, but priority 3 is where life or property is not at risk and an immediate response is not required. And this accounts for 51% of total calls. 65% of all calls for service are dispatched, whereas 35% are officer-initiated. I think this is an important clarification because as we're talking about this data, we're looking at calls for service, not just 911 calls. The 911 calls would be represented by those calls that are dispatched. When we look at the top initial call problem by volume for those dispatched calls, we're looking at disturbance other, alarm burglar, check welfare urgent, suspicious person, DOC/CO violation, which is any city ordinance violation that requires a law enforcement response. And this is sort of thinking about those initial call problems as the information is coming in through the community members and how that's getting categorized. This data cannot tell you the lived experience of those calls, either from the point of view of the community member or the call taker. And so that's something that we may wish to dive deeper into in future sessions. Top initial call problem category for officer-initiated calls are traffic stop, on-site incident, checking area, special assignment, and directed patrol. Next slide. This is an example, or this is a dashboard that is really generally looking at 3.5 years of calls for service. And this is where you can see popping out in the upper left-hand part of the screen that a large volume of calls are in priority 3. So the priority definitions, if we're starting at 0, that's where something is in progress and everyone is on the scene. It's your most urgent call for service. Priority 1, perhaps something just occurred and people may be on the scene. It's still very urgent, but it's dialed down just a little bit from priority 0. Priority 2 is in progress. It just occurred. There's minimal or no immediate threat, whereas priority 3 is life or property is not at risk and an immediate response is not required. Priority 4 is where the police are not required, but documentation is. You can see in the numbers in the top left-hand screen that the numbers of calls for service in 3.5 years of priority 4 are very low, so we have omitted them from the dashboard visualizations. Over in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see a time spent analysis, which we've broken out into 2 parts. The average response time is traditionally how we think of our performance measures for 911 calls for service. So we've separated that out. That's the initial call time to the time the primary officer arrives on the scene. Whereas the bottom average time on scene is all of the police officers, primary and backup, how long they've spent on scene, and this is according to the different sort of priority definitions. This time spent analysis is an average, however, and as we dug through the data, averages don't tell you a lot about how much time officers are spending on various things, because the wide range of distribution is very great. So if you click on the next slide, we've offered a dashboard that really digs into how officers spend their time. We looked at the range of police officers assigned by call. Sometimes there's a single officer, but other times there are multiple backup officers. And so for this count of calls, you can see, 742,000 had 1 officer response, 607,000 had 2 officers, 3 officers, 4 officers, and so forth. You can also dig into that data by priority call. You can look at the average response time by range of officers. So if we think about a single officer, 2, 3, or 4, sort of thinking about bands of, some incidents had 5 or 8 officers, others had 8+ officers. This can give you a sense of the average response time. And then down at the bottom, this is the distribution. And right here is a screenshot of the dashboard, but the link is in the bottom corner. So if you were to link over to it, which you don't have to do right now, but anybody can take this link and go look at this dashboard and see sort of where is the median time on scene for the different incidents where we might have more than 1 officer. Up in the top right-hand corner, you can look at it by type of initial call problem. So really, we've given you the ability to dig into this data in a number of different ways, and this dashboard is responsive. So if you wanted to click into, traffic stop, or you wanted to click into no report, other pieces of the dashboard would change. Next slide. In the top insights, we mentioned that around 65% of calls were dispatched versus 35% officer initiated. This is the dashboard where you can dig into 3.5 years worth of calls for service data and see the different patterns. And we mentioned that there were different initial call problems, whether dispatched or officer initiated. Again, this dashboard is responsive. If you were to click on dispatched calls, the entire dashboard would turn blue, and you would see the responsive information, including the average time spent. Next slide. We wanted to give a sense of that call problem transformation. And here's where we start to lead into where are those areas of further inquiry where this data can potentially be useful for a co-created reimagining public safety process. When we look at disturbance other, which was one of the top initial call problem categories for dispatched calls, 49% of those calls were updated. And this word cloud gives you a sense of volume and magnitude, as well as the long tail of types of calls that they were updated to. So perhaps the caller, initially said there's something going on, and either that call escalated, de-escalated, or the true nature of that incident became known. As we were working through this data, Lieutenant Murphy, who is helping us noted, for instance, the other day there was a call problem that was a disturbance other. Someone said that their boyfriend was making a scene in a restaurant, and later that scene, as he exited and went to his car, turned into a suicide. So we cannot know how these calls will transform, but retrospectively, we can look at the data and we can say, what were the patterns in our community? And for the 3.5-year data set, family disturbance, criminal trespass, assault with injury were some of the larger call transformations that happened. Next slide. 29% of suspicious person call problem categories were updated to these kinds of call problems: suspicious vehicle, assist complainant, criminal trespass. Again, if we wanted to dig further in, we would grab some parameters of the data and we would do a deeper dive to understand the true nature of some of these categories and how they might lend themselves to a reimagining process. Next slide. 55% of check welfare urgent calls were updated to these categories. EDP intervention is emotionally disturbed person, emergency detention, deceased person, assist EMS, were some of the call problem categories. Next slide. This is the updated dashboard with mental health calls. You may recall from our last presentation where we only had 1 month of data. Now we have 6 months of data, whereas all of the other dashboards are 3.5 years. The mental health diversion really started in earnest at the beginning of this calendar year. The numbers here are relatively small in the grand scheme. 10% of all calls were flagged over the past 6 months as having a mental health component. But I would also just honor that this program is just getting started. And as the program goes on, we'll be able to add more initial call problem categories to be screened for potential mental health flags. And this is an example, Councilmember Flanagan, where I would like to click on the link to go to the dashboard. So here, if we go to the count of calls by initial problem category, one of the key areas of interest is when we talk about diversion of calls. If you scroll into that little top quadrant where you have the call problems and it starts with check welfare urgent, if you put your cursor in there and scroll down a little bit, you'll come down to one pretty shortly and it'll say CCD counselor. Might be up just a little bit more. I think it's in the 300 range. There you go. CCD counselor is a true diversion problem category. These 328 officer-initiated, 328 mental health calls went to a counselor. They never an officer. And this is an example where we really have to understand administratively how this data works in order to pull out the measurement of a true diversion. But as you go through this dashboard, you can see the types of initial call problem categories that are being addressed, as well as the time on scene, the range of officers, and you can see a relatively stable call volume month over month. We can go back to the slide presentation for a moment, and then I think we're about ready to open up for questions and conversation. Out of this initial deep dive into 3.5 years worth of calls for service data, we see some key areas of opportunity. We can deep dive into specific initial and updated call problems. Alternatively, we can go back in the other direction, as Jonathan had mentioned, and we can look at the RMS data and work backwards and say, how did this call start? Start with the ending and figure out how it started. Either way, starting with the calls and working them through the system, or starting with the end and seeing how they started, that deep dive can look differently by different types of inquiries. If we were to do a deep dive inquiry into traffic stops, that would look very different than a deep dive into disturbance other calls. By deep diving into the data, we can inform a pilot of alternate responses, not unlike a lot of the key work that has already been done with the mental health flag. And then we need to be able to strengthen our data collection and analysis, but we will note that there are key challenges in undertaking that, which underlies a real change management process that is ultimately why Jonathan is here as the Chief APD Data Officer. Next slide. I think we'll pause here. There are other dashboards where you can just dive into initial call problem category or false alarm indicators. And in our next steps, we've sort of indicated what we said we would do on August 6th. Where are we today in terms of what we've achieved? And where would we still like to go with our analysis? We need to do more of cleaning the location-based data. Once we do that, we can look at gentrification maps and sort of a call for service correlation that maybe happens over time. We want to do journey maps. What is the day in the life of an officer responding to calls? What does that look like? And we still want to have a conversation about not just how to represent this data in a dashboard on Tableau, but how do we have an open data, San Antonio and Dallas have different ways that they represent this data in an open data format, and we can have that conversation here in Austin as well. So with that, I will leave it over for questions and any commentary on this data and the next steps.
Thank you, Carrie. Really fascinating information in this deeper dive, and I'm glad to see that first month of work, or that first month analysis that you did really expand into something really, really substantive. If there are questions for Carrie that you want me to reference and keep the slides up, maybe we do those first. Or if there's any other questions, I can pull the slides down where we can kind of better see each other. Anybody have questions for staff? Councilmember Kassar?
I do, and I don't think I need the slides for this part.
All right.
I just want to look at each other. First of all, this is really helpful and more comprehensive while being deep, but also self-explanatory in many ways. I know that I didn't word that as nicely as your presentation is, but it's just a really good job, so thank you. And I'm glad that it'll keep evolving. So there's a lot there, and I think there's a lot that maps out that we can work on in the future. There are two areas that you identified in your next steps that are areas that we've been talking about for a long time, though, because they stick out around burglar alarms and mental health calls. It seems like you're going to do continued work in those two areas. I know that there's a lot of areas you've identified that we're going to have work with the Reimagining Task Force and this committee moving forward. But on those two, since it seems like you've already really started to dig in, what are we learning from this continued analysis that we should know about? Or what ideas are you starting to have, maybe alongside talking to other people about those two, big pieces of calls where we might be thinking about doing things differently?
I think for that, for the burglar alarms, it might be useful to bring in Chief of Staff Troy Gay, and for the mental health program, how that diversion is going. I believe Lieutenant Ken Murphy can speak to some of that ongoing work.
And Carrie, more than I absolutely would want them to speak to that. I guess from the data, what are we learning that is new, or what are you seeing that is new that might help us inform those conversations with Integral Care and the police department and all the people implementing this? But just from the now that you've looked at this so much more carefully with more time, what's sticking out to you on the data side?
On the mental health calls, what's sticking out to me is, we've had a conversation with BJ from the Meadows Institute, who did the initial report that you all received in 2019. And the categorization is a bit of a challenge. When you look at some of the categorizations of mental health calls, you might see no or unknown mental health calls. Well, to me, no or unknown are two different categories, but they've been lumped into the same category, which makes understanding, like, if I know that there is absolutely no mental health flag, then I would say no. But if I'm not sure, I might say unknown. That's an example of where the categorization can be a bit of a challenge, and it sort of speaks to how some of our data is created administratively, maybe not necessarily with analysis in mind. Knowing how to hunt for the CCD counselor to say this is a 100% tried and true diversion, I wouldn't have necessarily looked in that area in order to find that data signal. So thinking about when we do a diversion program, how is it that we're categorizing it so that we can measure it, so that we can understand our progress, I think is going to be really important going forward. And that's one of the takeaways that I have here. In terms of burglar alarms, one of the things we're waiting to do is clean up the location-based data so that we make sure that we're being accurate when we present our findings to you. But we're looking at perhaps doing at least an initial cursory count, similar to how we did the time spent analysis, where we're like, here's the volume, where a repeat longitude and latitude is happening, where we can see perhaps a curve. Like, if we have this information where after 3 false alarms you have a fee to pay, we could hopefully then look into the data to say, well, what's the distribution of calls? Are we seeing a large distribution at 3 or at 4 calls? Are we seeing it drop off? And we can start to then go in and assess how that fee program is working in order to prevent false alarms. But without really having cleaned the location sort of data, I would be worried that we weren't giving you accurate information. So that's the next step on that.
And on the false alarms, we talked once before about, and I forget if you were here for that or not, about seeing residential versus commercial alarms, since those are pretty different systems, and whether or not, and then figuring out what percentage is false in either case, just because those they're kind of different things. Is that something that you've been able to? Is there going to be a way for us to actually look at that, or is that?
We have to pull data from a different system, to look at the commercial properties. So I think part of the key there is cleaning up the location-based data and then comparing it to a permitting system where we can be sure that we're comparing the addresses and it's a commercial property.
But those 100,000 or 90,000 or so that you showed, those are commercial and residential combined. That
is correct. That is all calls. Mm-hmm.
Right. It'd just be useful to know if they're more false in one category than another. If commercial 80% of them are residential, 80, that would be really useful. Okay, thank you.
And my apologies for not being able to answer that for you this time around. It's literally just a level of effort and data cleaning problem for us. But I promise you, we're not going to forget it.
No, that's okay. And I mentioned it to you because I forgot if I had said it to you or to someone else. And of course, I'm happy to have APD or whoever else speak to this, but my questions were really about the data. So of course, Chief Gay, or if anybody else wants to pipe up, you can, but I feel like I've had my questions answered here.
All right, Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. So I'm trying to find the slide number now. I think it's slide 14, I want to say, where you have the circle with the officer-initiated calls of 35%.
So I need to bring it back up for everybody.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah. So I was intrigued by the count of calls by priority, by that color. So it looks like almost all of our officer-initiated ones are priority 3 calls. And that's just really interesting. And obviously, you know, there may be some way to manage how they're spending their time if we need to get to the priority 1, 0, 1, and 2. And I'm just trying to understand, this may be standard within the police protocols, but that data just really speaks to me. I'm just wondering what we could dive down into there to understand better the officer-initiated calls and the choices that are being made. And this is particularly interesting to me because it looks like the officer-initiated and considered priority 3, and that's one of the things that I hear all the time from my constituents that they want more of. So I'm just I'd just love to know what else we can say about that from this data.
Sure, and I'd like to perhaps turn it over to Jonathan or Lieutenant Murphy, but from my perspective, looking at this data, this is how the calls get started. And the nature of how calls get started by the community members or by officers, you can also see the patterns where traffic stops, on-site incidents, just looking down, checking area, special assignment, those have higher volume of officer initiation, whereas what the community is calling about is, disturbance, other, alarm burglar, check welfare, suspicious person, code violations that require law enforcement response, trespass urgent. And I think that when you look at this dashboard, it's really, what is the nature and characteristic of each type of call? Like if you want to get into the process, then certainly Lieutenant Murphy or Chief of Staff Troy Gay can tell you how do these things kick off and how do assignments get made. That's not really sort of how this dashboard works. It's really more of a retrospective on what happened, what are the volumes, how were the calls concluded, what's it look like by sector. So for example, and when you click on the link to this, you can actually, and perhaps, Councilor Flanagan, it's worth doing that. You can see how things change. So if I were to click on officer initiated, the whole dashboard changes just to show you exactly those trend lines. Or if you want to go back to normal, just click on officer initiated again, and the dashboard resets. If you were to click on, say, the George sector down below, you'll start to see changes in the categories of calls. George, of course, is the downtown area, and you're going to see a really different sort of fingerprint, if you will, of the types of calls that are happening there. If you click on George again, it'll reset to normal. If you want to know sort of what are the kinds of calls that are getting a report written, you could click on report written, and then the dashboard will change again. And so I think it's really important to think of this dashboard as a retrospective of what happened rather than something proscriptive of what is happening, in order to think about those volumes or those patterns of what's happening. And then if you have a question, if you're like, why is it, tell me more about, there's 41,000 calls that are disturbance other that have a report written about them. I'd like to know about that subset, what patterns are going on there. That's the kind of line of inquiry that we can take from here and start to dig into with Jonathan's help and Lieutenant Murphy's help to provide any insights that are helpful to think about, how we may wish to do things differently.
So when there's a no report written,
Mm-hmm.
this may be more for PD, what does that mean? Because it's, more than half the calls, or it looks like more than half the calls for officer-initiated have no report. Close to that also for the other.
And I'll call attention to the appendix because I had all of these very same questions. There's a lot of lingo here. On slide 28 and 29, well, slide 27 lists all of the definitions of the different dispositions. 28 says, hey, what triggers a requirement for a report to be written? And 29 says, what are the different reasons an incident might not require a report to be written? And so we can go in and learn a little bit more about that. So one of the things that we tried to do, because I know this is a question that we all have, is does report written mean that there was a criminal offense? And our data doesn't link up very well. I think we mentioned that we have the records management system, we have the CAD system, the computer-aided dispatch, and we're trying to take the master incident number and link the two together to say, what does this tell us? And the master incident numbers weren't quite linking up for us, so we have to do some transformation on that. But we found, a reason to believe that not all report written equals a criminal offense, and some of the report not written was represented in the crime data. So we know there's some variability there, and we haven't finished answering what that looks like. But that's sort of part of the next step of saying we start to understand how these calls are transforming. We don't have the full understanding of how it traces to an outcome, but that's where Jonathan was suggesting we can start backwards with the RMS and understand how things start. But I think there's a reasonable proxy that if a report is written that there was something suspected about a criminal offense, but you can also see that crashes involving bicyclists are something else that get a report written about them. So perhaps Jonathan or Lieutenant Murphy might want to say more about that.
I would just say, generally, and you started with a very important point, that looking at traffic enforcement, and I think Carrie has tried to make the point that, the dispatch data really shows you what's coming in, right? What's coming in via the 911 system, and the officer initiated is sort of an entirely different set of data. But we might want to link this to a higher level discussion about the various roles that the police department plays. And so we might think about this, I might kind of generally categorize it as there's response, and so those would be the dispatch calls. And in that other area, the officer initiated, you have a couple different things like traffic, and then the other part that you would probably put in there generically would be something like patrol, right? So something that would be encountered on patrol. And as you think about re-envisioning public safety, I think the data help to the extent that they help you understand the magnitude of each of these activities, right? And so, as you talk about traffic enforcement being, important to your constituents, yet also being, a lower priority as far as response goes, that's because we really should think about response, patrol, and traffic enforcement as sort of three very different functions. And so it can be kind of helpful to organize the kind of thinking along those lines. The officer initiated doesn't in and of itself give you that kind of breakdown, but you get some sense of that by looking at the officer initiated. If you subset to that by clicking on officer initiated calls, turning the screen orange, and then you can see on the left-hand side of the dashboard the number that are traffic stops, and you can see the rest of the categories that are there. And that kind of helps give you a breakdown. But it is important to recognize, as Carrie said, this is kind of a picture of, it's kind of a snapshot that gives you some sense of how things are starting. And yet at the same time, it's also important to think about it, conceptually as what the functions of policing, are, and that might help with the discussion about what they should be.
Try again.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay. So this doesn't, if I'm understanding correctly, this doesn't help me if I'm trying to figure out if it should have been dispatched to police in the first place. Maybe it should have gone to EMS. Maybe it should have gone to fire. Maybe it should have gone to, I don't know if we can just send it to mental health. This is only going to tell me what went to police or what was initiated by police. It's not going to help me understand, unless we do a deeper dive into this particular issues, to understand if there's certain things that could be rerouted elsewhere. Is that correct? So this is not telling me anything about EMS or 911 or if something got routed to the wrong bucket beyond that it's in the police bucket. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's, and it kind of speaks to, it does. This is sort of what's happening in the CAD on the policing side. And that discussion, which is, a very important discussion about what are the calls coming in and perhaps which ones could be rerouted or handled differently. It points to something that I think Carrie tried to illustrate earlier, which is that the various categories of information that you see among that initial information set, they're not fully exhaustive. They don't really capture every possibility. They're not mutually exclusive. So as you can see with the word clouds, very many times a call will come into something seemingly very different, and yet ultimately it turned out to be the same thing. And so, we can look at the kind of initial incident type information among these calls that are coming to the department, and we can, to the extent possible with the data systems, look at what those ultimately turned out to be and what the actual outcome of that was. Was there a citation? Was there an arrest? Was there a report written that can give us some more context for what happened? And that's something but it is important to note that this is not giving a picture of outside of in the mental health flag calls, those that are the 384 calls that are getting the diversion of the program. This isn't giving a sense of what would have happened had these been routed elsewhere. And it can be difficult to know. One of the things we hope to do moving forward, it's on our list to follow up on, is to share with you a little presentation on kind of a day in the life of an officer to give you a sense of what does it mean when there's not a report written? What does it mean that there was no citation or no arrest? Because very often that doesn't necessarily mean that the response wasn't ultimately part of the solution to the incident that rendered the call in the first place.
Council members, Ken Murphy here. If I may jump in, I can explain a little bit more about the routing. So when a person calls 911, the first question asked is, do you need police, fire, EMS? And pretty soon we'll have the fourth tier, which is mental health services. So if the caller says, I need EMS, we automatically conference in the EMS dispatcher and or the fire dispatcher if they say fire. If they say they don't know, then we continue with a line of questioning to try to figure out what services they actually need. And if it goes on and say we're dispatching officers, but then things change, then we can still conference in EMS. So all of the calls you are seeing referenced in the dashboards, they're all police calls. Those do not include fire or EMS because they have a different data set. We're all in the same CAD, but we have siloed data sets. So this is all police. Councilmember Alter, does that clear up your question about? Yes. Okay. I see your head shaking. Then I also want to jump into the category or the priority 3 calls, and especially the officer initiated calls, because when we talk about officer initiated, there is no response because the officer sees something and they initiate the call, like a traffic stop or a subject stop, and so there is no response. So when we talk about officer initiated, it's what the officers are seeing when they're out there on patrol and they're calling in and asking a call to be made for it. Now, a vast majority of those priority 3 calls, when we talk about special assignment, because there was a large number of special assignment until recently, a year ago, special assignment meant secondary employment when officers were working a secondary job as security somewhere, either for Capital Metro or they were working a UT game or they were working one of our festivals in town. because every officer has to log on when they're working a secondary employment job, it fell under these special assignment categories. A year ago, we separated them out, and now we have a secondary employment and a special assignment, meaning now the special assignment is only if they're asked to do something special on patrol. Instead of just regular patrol and responding to calls, they need to focus on one area, maybe a hotspot where a crime has been occurring, and they're under a special assignment. So that's what we consider special assignment now. Also, there's a high volume of those priority 3 calls, which are directed patrols, which again focuses in on hotspots where our analysts say, hey, we're having a spike in burglary of vehicles in this area, or we're having a spike of burglary of non-residents in this area. Officers will put themselves out on a directed patrol in the area when they're not responding to calls to check those areas and do a high visibility patrol. Does that help clean up some of the priority 3 calls and why there are so many?
So much good information in this dashboard. I just want to keep clicking around and finding new little tidbits to ask about. The officer initiated stuff is so interesting because it really does get into to a level of detail on the job itself that is very hard to represent in the data. And so that might be an interesting conversation, Chief Gay, you and I, or Chief Manley, or whatever, kind of think about how to talk through what that really means, so that we can better understand. I would hate for, like this no report thing being reduced down to there wasn't a crime, when we're hearing that's not what that means. And I mean, we've certainly as a council said, sometimes you don't have to criminalize people, but the response was still needed. And so, there's a lot of kind of detail and nuance in there. The one that I wanted to ask about was when you were on the officer initiated this category of on-site incident. Do we know what that means? And I'm sorry if it's in the presentation and I missed it.
Councilmember Lieutenant Murphy here again. On-site incident, it simply means when an officer sees something and they call it in over the radio and ask the dispatcher to create a call for service. Most of the time the dispatcher will put them out as an on-site incident because they don't know what it is yet until the officer clarifies and gets out and figures out what's going on the scene. So he may see 2 people arguing and he'll say, put me out on on-site at this location. And until he gets out and actually investigates what's going on, it may be a family disturbance. And then the call will change to a family disturbance. And maybe a report was written, maybe a report was not written. However, by policy, if it's family disturbance, they should write a report. And again, going back to reports, no report doesn't always mean that something wasn't documented, because what we're not capturing in the no reports are citations. We're not capturing crash reports in the no reports, and we're not capturing field observations. So, which is also included in our RMS systems.
So that makes sense when you dig into the data and you see that George has by far the most of these on-site incidents where you might expect a more density of people waving down officers and asking for engagement.
Correct. Yes, sir.
And every other part of town that's, frankly, a lot more spread out and people have more distance between each other. You're not really getting waved down as much.
Correct. You're absolutely right. And that's why we see, like you said, that's why we see a high count of on-site incidents, because we have a higher density of police officers in a smaller area. And historically, before COVID, a lot of things happened downtown on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights. So there were a lot of on-site incidents by the officers patrolling on bike and horse and foot patrol. Yes, sir, you're correct.
It's interesting that you see the officer initiated take a real big spike right at like 11 o'clock.
Yes, sir. That's usually downtown when we see the spike in calls, and you have fights, you have little verbal disturbances going on between 11 and 2:30 a.m. is where we see the spike in the downtown area of on-site incidents pre-COVID, right?
Yeah, it's almost interesting that the spike happens more at 11 and less at 1. And you just think about how, mean, it's such an interesting little data point to see on the chart.
Yes, sir.
Other questions?
You may have already done this, Chairman, but is there a link to that site, and is the presentation in backup? I didn't see it in backup.
I don't think, Carrie, that we put it in backup yet, but
I just sent it to Katie Powers earlier today, so it should be arriving there. And the presentation has the link. So at every slide where you see a dashboard, there's a link directly to that dashboard. And then some of those top problem categories are also defined in the appendix. I think I grabbed like the top 30 or 40 call problem categories and provided the definition back there. So a lot of that is in there.
and Deputy City Manager, it might be valuable to have these links on the new Reimagining Public Safety pages that staff has created.
We plan to do that and to send it to the task force directly.
Excellent. There's so much.
One
this
final-
is almost. Go ahead. Go ahead, Karen.
One final thing that I might note too is when it comes to really digging into some of these calls, we do have some really innovative officers that have created community observation or critical observation of police and community, a thing called COPAC. There was a presentation given, I think, to the Public Safety Commission back in before COVID, in the before times, not that long ago, but forever ago, where they would take these calls for service and they would analyze them by the trigger that was present, trying to look for a root cause to try to call upon a more sustainable response. That initiative got out to 2 different police sectors. It doesn't have a lot of data associated with it, but as a lot of folks have explained to me, you know, if a gun is present, if a mental illness is present, if alcohol is present, like there's different triggers that are happening in a particular scene, and then they could keep track of those triggers and try to get underneath some of the trends that they were seeing. We hope to dig a little bit deeper into that initiative to see what we can learn from their experiences trying to do that, to even better understand some of these trend lines that we're seeing in the calls for service data.
Well, thank you, Kara. I'll be glad to get this up on the city site too. As I was about to say before, there's such density of data that a little bit of community crowdsourcing can be useful too. Councilmember Gassar?
No, I want to thank you all before we close, because we went so deep into things. It seems like a lot of the focus and conversation we've had recently, though, also is validated by some of this, because of course we do get important phone calls about assaults or armed robberies, but I want to just reiterate this because a lot of folks watching probably don't have the main screen up. And basically what the front of the dashboard seems to show is that 2/3 of the calls or of the police, majority of police time goes to going to responding to 911 calls, of which the big 3, the top 3 incidents are disturbances, which you said most likely later get coded as family incidents, family violence, other family interpersonal disturbance. Second, burglar alarms, and then third, welfare calls that more often than not are then later coded as having to do with emotional distress or mental health. So those 3 areas of burglar alarms, mental health, and family violence issues seem to be the main things driving the things that police are spending most of their time on when they're getting dispatched to calls. And then on the officer-initiated side, which is a smaller portion of their time, the number one thing is traffic stops, which we're all talking about and thinking about. And then second to that is those incidents of catching things as you go on patrol, which seems to most heavily be happening downtown. So that seems to me to be like the kind of overarching stuff, which signals that I think a lot of what this committee and council are looking at is on the right track of really trying to focus on those really big drivers of police time.
Councilmember Tovo, I did see your hand up. You know, your video keeps coming in and out.
For a while, I was frozen with my hand up, so I thought that was helpful.
Yeah.
So, thank you. I can't control it for some reason. I have no idea why I'm freezing, but thank you for recognizing. So I'm really just looking at this for the first time. I think it was mailed out, but not, I think it was, for some reason, I was not on the mailing list this morning. So I haven't had a chance to really dig into this data. I want to thank you all for it. I think this is an extremely useful analysis. And I also don't want the moment to pass without really thanking our dispatchers. I know probably some of my colleagues have done this as well, but I've had an opportunity to go and see the 911 call center, and it's just pretty extraordinary. And the level of focus and experience and just ability to manage a very stressful situation that all of our call takers, both on 911 and 311, are balancing in the course of their work is just extraordinary. So thank you to all of our city employees who do those jobs, those really important jobs. Carrie, I had a couple questions for you, and then I think I have one for our police department. As we look at, were you able to make any, well, I'm not sure who this question is for. You know, as I look at the number of reports and really trying to understand that situation where reports were not written, to those of you who have emphasized that that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't recorded in some way, because there's other categories where a citation might have been written or a crash report might have been written, but not necessarily a full report. Are there other times where, especially downtown, where officers might be going from one situation to another situation to another situation that could also account for there being a lack of a full report written? And I guess that's a question for the police department, but
yeah, I think that's a
Carrie,
question for
your
the
team.
Yeah.
I guess I would be interested to know whether there was any geographic, the extent to which that you could see geographic trends with regard to where reports were written.
I'll state my understanding, but then I think it's to perhaps Lieutenant Murphy to make sure I'm saying this correctly. Officers, if they have to fill out a report, they have to fill out a report. If they can do it in the moment, they'll do it in the moment. But maybe they have to go from incident to incident to incident, and maybe they don't get to the report until a later time. Incidentally, this can also relate to a variation in the time spent on scene. You know, if they weren't able to clock out, and then they clocked out after they finished the report, that can introduce some variability. But my understanding, if a report has to be filed, a report will be filed. If it can't be filed in the exact moment, it'll be filed afterwards. Did I do that right, Lieutenant Murphy?
Yes, ma'am, you're correct. According to policy, if a report needs to be written, it must be written before the end of the officer's shift. So they may jump from call to call, or a primary to a backup situation, and especially downtown. However, the reports are written before the end of their shift.
But as Carrie said, it could introduce some variability in terms of how much that gets reflected, that scenario gets reflected in terms of how much time on the scene is registered. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
And then I think you or one of your colleagues would be the right person to help us understand, or help me understand, what assist complainant, what are the range of things that could fall within that? I noticed that coming up as a larger word that repeats itself in the word mapping. I wondered if you could give us some examples of the range of things from across the severity spectrum that might fall into that.
Assist complaint, yes, ma'am. Assist complainants are normally very low on the severity scale, if you will. It can range from anything from assisting a person to a motorist, an officer assisting a motorist changing a tire, an officer being waved down to provide directions or information. So there's a wide range, and right off the top of my head, I can't think of any more than those examples. However, it's something where a report does not need to be written, and it doesn't necessarily fall into any of our other CAD title codes, if you will.
And actually just a couple days ago, had the experience of driving behind an officer or driving behind a scene where an officer was doing just that, changing a tire, helping somebody change a tire on Lamar. What I'm really noting, though, is on page 16, it says 29% of suspicious person incidents were updated to reflect assist complainant. So that's one of the reasons I asked that question. It seems to me that if people are calling about a suspicious person, or people are being dispatched, officers are being dispatched because of a call about a suspicious person, what does that mean when they're reclassified or classified as assist complainant? So you may, that just bears some more info about, and maybe not necessarily right now.
Yes, ma'am. It'd be really difficult to tell without doing a deep dive into each call. That was a suspicious person and then later changed to an assist complainant. However, right off the top of my head, I can think of an example. Maybe someone sees in their neighborhood a vehicle driving around, or somebody standing in their neighborhood they haven't seen before, and they call, and we title it a suspicious person because we don't know what's going on yet. And the caller actually says this person is suspicious, and well, why is it suspicious? Well, we haven't seen them here before in the neighborhood, and they're just driving around, or they're walking around, and then officers get on scene and they're looking for someone, or they're lost. And so then the officer provides direction, and then we change it to an assist complainant from a suspicious person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for talking me through at least what some of those scenarios might be. In 17, one of the things that especially as we try to make sense of some of the broader trends, I wanted to ask a couple detailed questions about this issue, that 55% of check welfare urgent calls were updated to be EDP intervention, or emergency detention. To what extent does some of this data reflect overlap? I'm just struck by the fact that some were updated to be emotionally disturbed person versus emotionally disturbed person intervention versus emergency detention, which I understand is in a classification all its own, but is it possible that some of this data is also overlapping with other categories? In other words, a similar incident might be classified as an intervention versus just DDP.
Yes, ma'am. You were correct. The detention is one standalone, because that's when the officers take someone into custody for their own protection. However,
which there are very few professionals who are under state law able to do.
Yes, ma'am.
Being one of those two categories.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. However, just the EDP title code and the EDP intervention, it could be one and the same. Depending on, so it's where they didn't take someone into custody yet they wrote a report. And so when one officer may title it EDP intervention, one officer may title it just emotionally disturbed person. So it could be one and the same. And that kind of segues into, I just wanted to let everyone know, all the council members know, the snapshot you saw for our CCD counselor on the screen, and the numbers you saw. Remember, that's just a snapshot in time of the first 6 months of the program. Since then, just today, we have had over 800 diversions. So it's a far cry from the 300 we saw in June, because June is when we really started to escalate the program, and we included the title codes of check welfare and check welfare urgent as possible diversions instead of sending officers. And so we've seen a significant increase. And in August, we actually hit our benchmark, which was 200 diversions for the month. We actually went over to 225 diversions. And just to segue into what's possible, when I looked at when a counselor was unavailable, either they were on a call, they were up for lunch, or they were not on duty, there was another possible 157 calls we potentially could have transferred to the counselor, and which would give us for the month a total of 382 calls, and at an 82% diversion rate means we would have approximately 318 true diversions. So we are heading in the right direction, and I think we will see a significant increase in these diversions once we're able to have a counselor on 24/7.
Thank you for that additional information. That's really very, very useful. Did you say 800 diversions, but by when? I missed the cutoff.
To date,
September
we're
or the-
to date,
it's
it's to date, yes, ma'am, since the start of the program in December of last year. We're over 800 transfers to the counselor.
Thank you, and thanks for the information about the potential overlap as we're trying to get a sense of the picture of the calls that could potentially be classified together, and thinking about them. That's helpful info. I think I have just one quick one, and then one possibly lengthier one. Teleserve. What does teleserve mean? That's on 28.
Yes, ma'am. Teleserve is when someone calls 311 and it's police centric. 311 places a customer service request in a queue, and then we have 911 operators who are cross-trained as non-emergency operators, and so they do dual jobs. And our non-emergency operators, based on the priority, we have 5 priority levels in our customer service request queue, will call citizens back and assist them, and either by providing information, providing guidance, or taking a report or writing a supplement to an existing report. So that's what we call teleserve historically.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
That might be a term. I'm sorry if I overlooked that in the definitions. I don't recall seeing it. And if it's not there, that might be something that would be useful for the public to know in among the definitions. And I want to just end with one last question, talking about the category of things that of situations that might fall within family disturbance. We've had a variety of community conversations around what gets classified or what might be classified as family disturbance. And I note that 49% of disturbance other calls were updated to reflect family disturbance. And I don't know that today is the day to have this information, but I would like to understand what kind of data we have to help the policymakers, to help the council, to help us all, the community at large, understand what data we have to reflect when an officer might need to be present versus situations that don't involve violence. So I don't know if you could speak to that issue today, but if so, I would invite you to, and also if you could share with us how we would even begin to understand that as a community, what those family disturbance, how likely it is that family disturbances that, based on past evidence, would fall into a category where violence might be present or might be at a high risk.
Yes, ma'am. I can speak generally on the family disturbances. So a family disturbance, when a family disturbance report is written, it's when there's been no violence, and when there's been no assault take place, there's no injury or anything involved. It was when folks are just arguing, whether it's direct family members or we classify just roommates who are, say you have 2 people living together and sharing an apartment. We also classify that under family disturbance. Or if they're ex-spouses and they're having a verbal argument, it's also classified under and should be written up as, under family disturbance.
So anything we see classified as a family disturbance, all those stats that you have within here as family disturbance did not involve violence at all?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. If violence would have been part of it, it would have been an assault with injury, or an aggravated assault or assault strangulation with the tag family violence.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense? Yes, ma'am. And I'd just like to thank you also for recognizing our dispatchers and call takers. They do a tremendously difficult job, and they're very good at it. And we're lucky to have such good operators and dispatchers here working for the city of Austin. And also, in case you all don't know, just a tag, so you can, if you want to see what our operators, 911 operators specifically, are doing. They were part of a filming project with ABC called Emergency Call, and it airs Monday, September 28th at 9 p.m. on ABC. And we are actually first up in the series premiere. So it's going to be a great series.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. Would you mind saying that again? September 28th, 9 p.m., and the show's name is?
Emergency Call.
Emergency Call.
Yes, ma'am, it's on ABC. So we were the pilot project for the series here in Austin a year and a half ago, and then ABC expanded it, and representative in this series will be 5 different call centers, but we are the largest call center, emergency call center among the 5. And again, we start the show off, and so I've seen the trailer in the first 15 minutes, and I think everyone will enjoy it. And it really gives you an in-depth look at what the 911 operators do, because it solely focuses on the 911 operators.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
I didn't know why it made me laugh so much. I feel like they were bringing on a guest to promote their latest project. That was pretty good, Lieutenant Ruby. So we'll watch for our amazing 911 operators and their television debut. How exciting.
Yes, sir. And it's hosted by Luke Wilson, to tag it even further.
Well, we'll have Luke on the show later. Let's see how this goes. Councilman Robert Madison has joined us too, so we've got a good group here today. Any other questions for our staff on the 911 call analysis? All right. Really, really great work, Carrie, Lieutenant Murphy, Chief Gay, all of the staff. This is really critical information as we dig into the areas of best opportunity to relieve the pressure on our staff, both our civilian and our sworn. So really good stuff. Looking forward to continuing to work through this and finding and expanding all alternatives, and to hear the diversion numbers going up. And one of the things that we invested in and heard from Integral Care, it's always nice to see a presentation from a provider turn into actual data later. So kudos to everybody for that. If there are no